Welcome to the Gary DeMar blogcast. This audio is brought to you by Canon Press.
Welcome to the Gary DeMar blogcast. The topic of today's entry is Problem Profiteers Have a Long and Sordid History. The racial divide in the United States is wider than it has ever been. The vast majority of Americans are not racists. They sympathize with Black Americans who have been treated unjustly. The history of Black suppression is real. It's been a slow road to right past injustices. Unfortunately, the Black Lives Matter movement has hijacked much of the goodwill that has been growing in the past few decades and turned race into a political club. It's getting to the point that anything and everything is racist. Requiring that students show their work in math is said to be racist. Even insisting on getting the right answer now is racist. Really? Showing an ID is racist. Come on. To do any business in the United States requires an ID. Try to cash a check, fly on an airplane, drive a car without identification. And yet, requiring people to have an ID to vote is racist since some people find it difficult to get an ID. Aren't there white people who find it difficult to get an ID in a state like Georgia? New polling shows that a large majority supports voter ID laws that require individuals to show a photo identification before voting, including almost 70% of Black voters. Exploiting race for political and financial advantage has a long history. Black leaders like Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton have made their living by promoting Black victimhood and white guilt. Jesse Jackson has been shaking down corporations using threats and boycotts against big-name corporations for years. Patrice Kahn-Coolers, the co-founder of Black Lives Matter, went on a real estate buying binge, snagging 4 high-end homes for $3.2 million in the U.S. alone, according to property records. Booker T. Washington, who was born in 1865, warned of such people within the Black community in his 1911 book, My Larger Education. He described them as problem profiteers. I'm quoting, "There is another class of colored people who make a business of keeping the troubles, the wrongs, and the hardships of the Negro race before the public. Having learned that they are able to make a living off of their troubles, they have grown into the settled habit of advertising their wrong, partly because they want sympathy and partly because it pays. Some of these people do not want the Negro to lose his grievances because they do not want to lose their jobs," close quote. Washington could have had in view, although writing more than 100 years ago, Black people who rail against a Black conservative like the late Herman Cain. Cain didn't present himself as a victim, and this disturbed people like Al Sharpton. Cain lived at a time when there were colored water fountains, segregated schools and neighborhoods, and racial discrimination that few people today can imagine. If anyone had a right to play the victim card, it was Cain. He didn't feel sorry for himself. He stayed out of trouble, worked hard, and made something of himself without the help of a cadre of poverty pimps. Cain was the antithesis of the Democrat Party and 90% of Blacks who support it. Washington continues with a story that encapsulates what is wrong with so many Black leaders and their guilt-ridden white supporters. Those victimizing Blacks are other Blacks. Washington explains how it was done in his day. Quote, "A story told me by a colored man in South Carolina will illustrate how people sometimes get into situations where they do not like to part with their grievances. In a certain community, there was a colored doctor of the old school who knew little about modern ideas of medicine, but who in some way had gained the confidence of the people and had made considerable money by his own peculiar methods of treatment. In this community, there was an old lady who happened to be pretty well provided with this world's goods and who thought that she had cancer. For 20 years, she had enjoyed the luxury of having this old doctor treat her for that cancer. As the old doctor became, thanks to the cancer and to other practices, pretty well-to-do, he decided to send one of his boys to medical school. After graduating from the medical school, the young man returned home and his father took a vacation. During this time, the old lady who was afflicted with the cancer called in the young man who treated her. Within a few weeks, the cancer, or what was supposed to be the cancer, disappeared and the old lady declared herself well. When the father of that boy returned and found the patient on her feet and perfectly well, he was outraged. He called the young man before him and said the following: "My son, I find that you have cured that cancer case of mine. Now, son, let me tell you something. I educated you on that cancer. I put you through high school, through college, and finally through the medical school on that cancer. And now you, with your new ideas of practicing medicine, have come here and cured that cancer. Let me tell you something, son. You have started all wrong. How do you expect to make a living practicing medicine in that way?" Close quote. There are so-called race problem solvers who don't want the patient to get well because as long as the patient is sick, they have an easy means of making a living and a way to make themselves prominent before the public, as well as wielding political influence for even more gain and prestige. Until Black people throw off the shroud of victimhood, they will be at the mercy of doctors who treat a self-inflicted cancer that only makes the doctors rich.
Thank you for listening to the Gary DeMar blogcast. For more from Gary and American Vision, check out the American Vision collection in the Canon app.